When we visited the Carter Center in May 2023, Tony Clark graciously offered to be our tour guide. At the time, Jimmy Carter was 98 years young, but had been admitted to hospice only a few months prior. Basically, this meant that he mostly rested at home, and hospice care focuses on keeping the patient comfortable rather than heroically trying to add just a few more months to their lives. And Jimmy Carter didn't pass away until late December in 2024, shortly after his 100th birthday, the oldest living president. His wife, Rosalind Carter, passed away some months prior when she was 96 years old. And she was diagnosed with dementia and was in hospice care for only a few months. We had previously reflected on the autobiography Jimmy Carter wrote when he was a nimble 90-year-old, and on what we learned when we visited his boyhood home and his high school, preserved by the National Park System, taking many photographs. Tony Clark told us many personal stories about Jimmy Carter that were not in the book, or that had been skipped over.
Jimmy Carter's presidency, we have a whole list on the wall of all the achievements that he did. But I keep thinking of a soundbite that Walter Mondale had about him. People have this impression that he's done wonderful things as a post-president, which he has, but a failed president. And Mondale says that view is actually wrong, and that he was really a very successful president. And I think that's what the museum shows. But it also shows his success as a post-president. He has really become the model for what presidents can do after they leave office. The nice things about the museum is we trace Carter's life. So when he's born, we've got a copy of his birth record here from his baby book. His parents named him James Earl Carter Jr. They said, we'll call him Jimmy now. But later, of course, it will be Jim. We're still waiting for him to grow up enough to be Jim. He kind of went from Jimmy to governor to Mr. President and got stuck there. He's only 98 years old now, so maybe sometime soon. I had asked Mrs. Carter if anybody had ever called him Jim, and she said no. His dad used to call him Hot or Hot Shot. I never called him Hot Shot. I always called him Mr. President, which actually is incorrect. That's only for the person who is actually in the office at the time. But all along here, we trace the president's life. One of the things his grandson likes to point to is his high school picture with all of his classmates. And Jason says, you know, you look at my granddad, and there's nothing in that picture that says this kid is going to grow up to be president of the United States and a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And I think what Jason is saying is that we all have the opportunity to make a difference in people's lives. We just have to do it. But the thing I like about this is I see how President and Mrs. Carter, why they are the way they are. In fact, down here, we've got the house he grows up in Archery, Georgia, which is just outside of Plains. And what's interesting about that is the Carters are one of two white families in Archery. Jimmy Carter is born in that farmhouse outside, and he's raised in that farmhouse outside of Archery.
So that was a Sears and Roebuck house.
Yeah, I think it is, yeah. Jimmy Carter is raised in that farmhouse.
So I don't think they built it. I think they bought it. So
well, they actually, someone else built it, and they bought it. Earl bought the house.
Yeah.
But the thing that's important about Carter growing up is he grows up during segregation. The Carters are one of two white families in Archery. His playmates are pretty much all African Americans. But the interesting thing is his dad is a great businessman, but his dad's a segregationist. His mom, Miss Lillian, is a nurse who treats everybody the same. And so if you're African American and you go to the house and Earl Carter is there, you're supposed to go around to the back door. But if Miss Lillian's there, you go in through the front door, you're welcome there, and Earl finds something else to do. In fact, one of Carter's favorite stories is when he's about 11 or 12, and it is the time of the Joe Louis Max Schmeling boxing match.
Joe Louis was a professional Negro boxer known as the Brown Bomber who competed from 1934 until 1951. He successfully defended his boxing title 25 times, a record that still stands to this day. He challenged the color line in sports, becoming a national hero. He served in the military during World War II and also helped integrate the game of golf.
And folks that work on the farm want to hear the boxing match. It's on the radio, but they can't afford a radio. So the Carters do have a radio. They don't have electricity at that point. They don't get electricity until Franklin Roosevelt gets polio.
Franklin Roosevelt developed a treatment facility with water therapy for polio patients at Warm Springs. FDR was a rising star in the Democratic Party when he contracted polio and discovered that these Georgia Warm Springs could help those patients who could not walk exercise their legs in the pool. In addition to his many political accomplishments, FDR organized the March of Dimes to raise money to find a cure for polio, founding one of the first national charities. Warm Springs is a mere 70 miles from Plains, whereas the Carter Center in Atlanta is 160 miles from Plains.
Goes down to Warm Springs, Georgia for treatment of polio, sees how expensive electricity is in rural Georgia. That leads to rural electrification that gets the Carters electricity. It's one of those strange coincidences that Franklin Roosevelt getting polio ends up getting the Carters electricity. But what they do during the Lewis-McSmelling fight is they hook up their radio to a car battery, put it in the window of the living room, which is in the front on the left-hand side, and folks that work on the farm gather under the tree that's peeking out the side. And the thing Carter remembers is that when Joe Louis wins the fight, everybody's quiet. There's no cheering. One gentleman goes up to Carter's dad and says, "Thank you, Mr. Carter." And then they go home. And that's when the cheering breaks out. And Carter realizes that they didn't feel comfortable cheering for the man they wanted outside the boss's house, knowing he's a segregationist. And I think it's seeing segregation firsthand that influenced Carter's efforts throughout the remainder of his life for human rights, because he saw what it was like not to be granted human rights. The other thing he saw as a child is his mom, being a nurse, was on call all the time. And there is a table in the living room that Miss Lillian used to leave notes to the family. Here's what you need to do today. This needs to be done. So-and-so needs to do this, whatever. She did that so often that the family called the table Mother, because that was how they communicated with him. So if you think about it, Carter has spent his life working for human rights, health care, and democracy. Two of those three things he learned as a child. Carter's dad was a segregationist, but it was a little bit more complicated than that, because his dad also said, spend a lot of time with this couple. Jack Clark, the gentleman with the beard, helps run the farm for the Carters. His wife, Rachel, Carter thought of as his second mother. Whenever his parents were out of town, he stayed with Jack and Rachel, learned a lot about woodwork and running a farm from Jack, learned a lot about dealing with people from Rachel. They used to go fishing together. He thought of her, as I say, as his second mother. In fact, Carter has said of the 5 people that influenced his life the most, only 2 of them are white. What's interesting, in Plains, they moved Jack and Rachel's cabin closer to the house because they were that much of an influence. And in fact, it's been a couple of years ago, I was visiting with Carter's minister, Tony Loudon, and at that time, Carter was a little bit more mobile than he is now. And Tony was talking about going out to the cemetery with Carter to see Rachel's grave, because she was that much of an influence on him. I think he learned a lot of humanity from her and from his mom. One of the 2 people that Carter said influenced his life the most, other than his family that are white, is Julia Coleman, his school teacher. She encouraged him to read. She had a program called Readers Make Leaders. One summer he read 26 books. In fact, he tells the story, she told him she had a book that she wanted him to read, and he had this vision of cowboys and Indians. In fact, it was War and Peace, which became one of his favorite books. She also got a chance. She was a member of the Chautauqua Society out of New York, which encourages hearing from authors and other lecturers. In fact, she started a Chautauqua Society in Plains. But she went up there, and she also got to meet Eleanor Roosevelt, and came back and said any schoolboy, even one of ours, might grow up to be president of the United States, which really is a stretch for somebody from Plains, Georgia, to think that they could be president of the United States. She is the only teacher we know of that has been mentioned by name in both a presidential inaugural address and a Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. But the thing he mentions the most, and I've heard him repeat this dozens of times, is something she taught him. We must adjust to changing times, but still hold to unchanging principles. Times change, and you have to adjust to those changes, but you have to have a core of principles that leads you to deal with those changes. The other thing that is interesting about her, we have Carter's 6th grade report card here. And in 6th grade, he's really smart. He makes A's in just about everything, which is interesting because his worst grade, a C and a B, is in music. And on the other side of the museum, we have the first of Carter's Grammy Awards, which show you can make your worst grade in music and still get a Grammy. Fortunately for us, his Grammys are in spoken word, so we don't ask him to sing. In fact, he's not the only president with a Grammy. Bill Clinton has 2. And Barack Obama has 2 Grammys. Jimmy Carter has 3. The other interesting thing about Carter is he is the first American president to have been born in a hospital. All the others were born at home. It's probably because his mom was a nurse. And he's the first one in his family to get higher education. I think his dad went through the 10th grade. His mom learned nursing at a clinic down in Plains and also at Grady Hospital. He always wanted to be in the Navy because he had an uncle, Tom Gordy, who was in the Navy. Wrote him from all over the world, got him interested in the world, interested in international things. And Tom was in the Navy, so he wanted to go to the Navy, but didn't get an appointment immediately, so he went to Georgia Southwestern in Americas. Then he got appointed to the Naval Academy, but they said he needed more work in engineering or physics, so he goes to Georgia Tech and then goes to the Naval Academy, and that's where he really wanted to be in the Navy throughout his life.
What really kind of amazed me about Carter was that he lives in a very plain house even today, and it just also seems to be a transition. You know, he grows up in a house with no indoor plumbing,
no electricity, plumbing.
And then he goes into the Navy and he specializes in nuclear submarine.
You see, that goes back to what Julia Coleman taught him about, that he could do anything he wants. He is really smart. He still carries a lot of Navy habits with him. I've done a number of events with him, and you always had to be ready at least on time, but preferably early, because he was going to be there either exactly on time or early. And he still, to this day, wears his watch with the face inside, because that's how, if you're at a periscope, you have your hands up here and you can look at your watch to see what time it is. In fact, when he went to the Navy, there were 800 and some students in his class. It was an accelerated class because World War II was underway, and I believe he was like number 32 the first year in his class. This is how he wants to spend his life, and at the time he was there, you wanted to be on a submarine. So this kind of gives you an idea of the size of a submarine, and in fact, you can see the young Jimmy Carter down near the periscope, up on the deck of the submarine. And it's while he's at the Naval Academy that he starts dating his sister's best friend, Rosalind Smith. In fact, he had gone home from the Naval Academy on a break, and he had a girlfriend, but his girlfriend had a date that night, so he's driving around with his sister and his sister's boyfriend, and they want to go to the movies, but he doesn't have a date. So they drive by the church and they see Rosalind Smith outside the church, and they ask her if she would like to join him. And Rosalind and Carter's sister have been sort of plotting their meeting for a long time. Now, he has known her all his life. In fact, Carter's mom helped deliver Rosalind and took her young 3-year-old boy over to see her when she was just a few days old. But it was kind of like the movie It's a Wonderful Life, where the Jimmy Stewart character has always known the Donna Reed character throughout his life, but never really seen her there. And so they pick Rosalind up, ask her if she wants to go to the movies with him. She does, and they go to the movies that night. And the next morning, Carter's mom said, "Well, how was your date with Rosalind?" And he pauses for a second and says, "That's the girl I'm going to marry." And it's interesting because he did a little while later ask her to marry him, and she turned him down. She had promised her dad that she would finish college, but he was persistent, and she finally agreed to marry him. And in fact, we have a photograph of the President and Mrs. Carter the day they got married. To me, they look like kids playing at getting married. He's actually 21 there, she's 18. She even kind of looks like a young Judy Garland in the picture. But she was so excited to get married to Carter. She said, "I think I'd always secretly wanted to get out of planes, and now I couldn't wait, because now she doesn't have her mother-in-law telling her what to do." But you know, the thing is, when he proposes to her and she accepts, one of the first things he does is give her a copy of the book, The Navy Wife. And the Navy Wife tells the woman how she is to act as a Navy wife. And it describes her as her pretty soft brown hair has the semblance of a natural curl. Her features are good. She has pretty teeth and a ready smile. She is slim and has a willowy figure. She is a cheery companion and an excellent dancer. And it goes on about how the Navy wife was supposed to be. Despite that, she loves being a Navy wife. She is traveling. He's out at sea a lot, so she's taking care of the family. She's making decisions on her own. She loves being a Navy wife. But 7 years after they get married, his dad gets pancreatic cancer and dies. And he tells her, he doesn't ask her, he tells her, "I've decided to leave the Navy. We're going back to planes. I'm going to take over the family business." She is not a happy camper at all. She wrote in one of her books, "I cried, I screamed, we argued, I thought the best part of my life was over." He tells the story. They're driving back to planes and she refuses to talk to him. If she has anything to say, it's through the kids. It's, "Jack, tell your father." "Chip, tell your father." Takes her a year to get into planes. Best part of her life is over. But then she becomes First Lady of Georgia, First Lady of the United States. It's not so bad. 1980 happens, as he puts it. He's involuntarily retired, goes back to planes. Best part of her life is over again. But then they start the Carter Center. She's traveling around the world, working on democracy, health, mental health, playing with her kids, her grandkids. Best part of her life. Even with the pandemic, when they are both at home, they are spending time together, holding hands, watching TV, just really enjoying their lives together. Kids and grandkids come down to visit. Even when they were here, they would spend 3 or 4 days a month here. They would go out walking hand in hand around the grounds. But it's a time to enjoy each other.
Next, we will continue our tour of the Carter Center, reflecting on Georgia politics and both Jimmy Carter's presidency and his post-presidential endeavors, including peacekeeping, election monitoring, and public health missions as head of the Carter Center. Although there's some overlap, our guided tour, his autobiography, and his devotions each have unique stories and insights.